September 490 BC, the plain of Marathon, northeastern Attica. The sun has barely risen over the Aegean Sea when 10,000 Athenian and Plataean soldiers look across the field and see what they are up against. The Persian camp stretches as far as the eye can reach. Tents, horses, supply lines, weapons, an entire war machine assembled on Greek soil. The fleet that brought this army across the Aegean was so large that ancient sources claimed it darkened the water. 600 warships, an infantry force estimated by Herodotus at around 25,000 men, though some ancient accounts push that number far higher. Cavalry units that had crushed armies across 3 continents. This was the force of Darius I, King of Kings, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, a dominion stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Aegean in the west. And standing across from all of that were 10,000 Greeks. No Spartan reinforcements, no allied fleet, no cavalry of their own. Just 10,000 citizen soldiers from Athens and 1,000 from the small city of Plataea, armed with spears and bronze shields, standing in a valley between the mountains and the sea, knowing that if they lost this battle, Athens would burn. This was not a skirmish. This was not a border dispute. This was the moment the Persian Empire decided to make an example of the city that had dared to challenge its authority, and the Greeks had nowhere left to run. What happened on that plain in the hours that followed is one of the most studied, debated, and analyzed military engagements in the entire history of warfare. The Athenians did not just survive. They destroyed the Persian force in front of them, killed over 6,000 enemy soldiers, lost fewer than 200 of their own, and then marched 40 kilometers back to Athens in full armor to stop the Persian fleet from landing on the other side of the city. In a single day. The Battle of Marathon did not just save Athens. It preserved the political experiment called democracy at the exact moment it was still fragile enough to be snuffed out permanently. It gave Greek civilization the space it needed to produce the philosophy, the art, the architecture, and the science that became the foundation of the Western world. 2,500 years later, we still run a race named after that battlefield. This video covers the full story. The empire that came to destroy Greece. The commander who had once served that same empire and now stood against it. The tactical decision that should not have worked but did. And what happened to the man who made it all possible after the battle was over. If this is the kind of history you want to see more of, subscribe and hit the bell right now. Every week we go deep into the battles, the leaders, and the decisions that shape the world you live in. Let's get into it. To understand what Marathon meant, you have to understand what Persia was. In 490 BC, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was the largest political entity in human history up to that point. It had been built in less than 60 years, starting from a relatively small kingdom in southwestern Iran, and by the reign of Darius I, it controlled territory from the Indus River in modern Pakistan to the coast of the Aegean Sea in modern Turkey and Greece. It absorbed Egypt. It absorbed Babylon. It absorbed the ancient kingdoms of Lydia and Media. Every major power of the ancient Near East had either been conquered or forced into submission. The empire was organized into administrative provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a regional administrator who answered directly to the king. This system allowed Persia to govern an enormous and diverse population with remarkable efficiency. Tax revenues flowed inward from every corner of the empire. Armies could be assembled from dozens of different peoples, each bringing their own weapons, fighting styles, and equipment. Persian logistics were, for the time, extraordinarily sophisticated. Darius I, who came to power in 522 BC after a period of internal conflict, had consolidated and expanded this structure. He built the Royal Road, a highway system stretching over 2,700 kilometers from Susa in Persia to Sardis in western Anatolia, which allowed messages and troops to move across the empire at speeds previously impossible. He standardized coinage, reformed taxation, and invested heavily in monumental architecture. His palace at Persepolis was one of the most ambitious construction projects of the ancient world. Militarily, the Persian army operated on a scale that no Greek city-state could match individually. Its core strengths were its archers, Persian and Median bowmen, who could saturate a battlefield with arrows before infantry contact. Its cavalry, which could outflank and pursue broken formations, and its sheer numerical depth. When Persia lost a battle, it could absorb the loss and send another army. For a small city-state like Athens, losing one battle meant losing everything. Greece, in contrast, was not a country in any unified sense. It was a collection of independent city-states, polis, scattered across the Greek peninsula, the Aegean Islands, and the western coast of Anatolia. These city-states shared a language, a religion, and a broadly common culture. But they were politically sovereign, frequently at war with each other, and deeply suspicious of any attempt at centralized authority. Sparta and Athens, the two most powerful polis, were rivals as much as they were neighbors. Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and dozens of smaller cities each pursued their own interests. This fragmentation was Greece's greatest strategic weakness. When Persia came, it came against a world that could not easily unite. The road to Marathon began not on the Greek mainland, but on the western coast of Anatolia, in the region the Greeks called Ionia. The Ionian Greeks, inhabitants of cities like Miltiades, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus, had been under Persian control since Cyrus the Great conquered Lydia in 547 BC. For decades, they lived under Persian-appointed tyrants and paid tribute to the empire. The arrangement was stable, but deeply resented. The Ionians considered themselves Greeks, spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and watched the democratic reforms spreading through mainland Greece with considerable interest. In 499 BC, the city of Miletus, led by its tyrant Aristagoras, launched an open revolt against Persian authority. Aristagoras traveled to mainland Greece seeking military support. Sparta, the most powerful Greek military state, refused. Athens and the smaller city of Eretria agreed to help, sending a combined force of 25 ships. The early stages of the revolt saw some success. In 498 BC, the combined Greek force marched inland and burned Sardis, the capital of the Persian satrapy of Lydia, a major regional center and a direct symbol of Persian power in the west. The burning of Sardis was a significant escalation. It demonstrated that Greek forces could strike deep into Persian-controlled territory, but the revolt ultimately failed. Persian military and naval superiority proved decisive. By 494 BC, Miletus was besieged. The decisive naval engagement at the Battle of Lade that year saw the Ionian fleet collapse, partly due to defections. Miletus was captured, its population killed or enslaved, and the revolt was systematically suppressed city by city over the following years. By 493 BC, Ionia was firmly back under Persian control. Darius I did not forget who had helped. The Athenians and Eretrians had sent ships. They had helped burn Sardis. Ancient sources record that Darius, upon hearing of the Athenian involvement, ordered a servant to say to him 3 times at every dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether the story is literally true or not, the political intent is clear. Athens had made itself an enemy of the Persian Empire, and Darius intended to respond. The first Persian attempt to punish Athens came in 492 BC, when Darius sent his son-in-law Mardonius with a large fleet and army through Thrace and Macedonia. The campaign made significant territorial gains in northern Greece, but was cut short when the fleet was wrecked by a storm off the rocky coast of Mount Athos, losing around 300 ships and 20,000 men, according to Herodotus. Mardonius returned to Persia. In 490 BC, Darius tried a different approach. Rather than advancing overland through Thrace, he assembled a naval expedition designed to cross the Aegean directly and strike Athens and Eretria from the sea. Command was given to 2 generals, Datis, a Median officer with extensive military experience, and Artaphernes, the son of the satrap of Lydia and Darius's own nephew. The fleet was substantial. Herodotus describes 600 triremes, though modern historians debate the exact composition. The force carried not just soldiers, but horses, the cavalry that was expected to be decisive in any engagement on open ground. The army included Persian and Median infantry, Saka warriors from Central Asia, and specialist units drawn from across the empire. The fleet moved methodically. Naxos, which had previously resisted a Persian attack in 499 BC, was burned, the sacred island of Delos was treated with deliberate respect. Deities made offerings at the sanctuary of Apollo, a calculated gesture of religious sensitivity designed to signal that Persia was not at war with Greek religion, only with Greek political resistance. Eretria was the first mainland target. The city, on the island of Euboea, had sent ships to support the Ionian revolt and was on Darius's list alongside Athens. After a siege of approximately 6 days, Eretria fell, betrayed from within by 2 of its own citizens who opened the gates to the Persians. The city was sacked, its temples burned, and its population enslaved and deported to Persia, where Darius settled them at a village called Ardarica in the Kissian region. The destruction of Eretria was a deliberate message to Athens. This is what happens to cities that oppose the empire. The Persian fleet then crossed the narrow strait to Attica and landed at Marathon, a coastal plain approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Athens. The location was not chosen randomly. Marathon offered a flat, open plain ideal for deploying cavalry. It had a sheltered bay for the fleet, and according to some ancient accounts, it was suggested by Hippias, the former Athenian tyrant who had been exiled from Athens decades earlier and was now traveling with the Persian force, hoping to be reinstalled as ruler of a conquered city. Of the 10 Athenian generals who would command at Marathon, one stands apart: Miltiades, son of Cimon, of the Deme of Lassiadae. Miltiades came from one of Athens's oldest aristocratic families. His family had a long and complicated relationship with power that went well beyond the borders of Attica. His uncle, also named Miltiades, had established a personal dynasty in the Thracian Chersonese, the long peninsula that controls the entrance to the Hellespont, the strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea. This was strategically and commercially one of the most important pieces of territory in the Greek world, sitting astride the grain routes that fed much of Greece. The younger Miltiades inherited this position and governed the Chersonese as what was effectively a personal tyrant. Though the word tyrant in Greek does not carry the full weight of its modern meaning, a tyrannos in ancient Greece was simply a ruler who held power outside normal constitutional channels, not necessarily a brutal or unjust one. Here is the element of his biography that makes his role at Marathon so historically extraordinary. Miltiades served as a vassal of the Persian Empire. When Darius I launched his campaign against the Scythians north of the Danube around 513 BC, Miltiades and the other Greek tyrants of the region were ordered to accompany the Persian army and guard the bridge of boats across the Danube that would allow the Persian army to retreat if necessary. According to Herodotus, when Darius's campaign ran into difficulties and the Scythians urged the Greek guardians to destroy the bridge and trap the Persian army, Miltiades advocated doing exactly that, destroying the bridge and letting Persia's army be destroyed in Scythia. The other tyrants refused, the bridge was held, and Darius returned safely. Whether Miltiades genuinely tried to destroy the bridge, or whether this story was constructed later to burnish his anti-Persian credentials, is debated by historians. What is not debated is that he spent years operating within the Persian imperial system, understood Persian military organization from the inside, spoke to Persian commanders, and observed Persian tactics directly. When the Ionian revolt broke out in 499 BC, Miltiades joined it, turning against the empire he had served. When the revolt collapsed in 493 BC, he fled the Chersonese ahead of a Phoenician fleet sent to capture him, narrowly escaping with his life. He arrived in Athens on a ship carrying a cargo of grain, a politically significant gesture in a city that depended on imported food, and immediately faced legal prosecution from his political enemies, who charged him with tyranny for his rule in the Chersonese. He was acquitted, but his position in Athens remained politically vulnerable. Then the Persians landed at Marathon. Whatever his complicated past, Miltiades had something no other Athenian general possessed: direct, first-hand knowledge of how the Persian military actually fought. He had seen their formations, understood their command structure, and knew their tactical assumptions. When the 10 generals met to decide what to do, Miltiades was not speaking from theory. He was the only man in the room who had stood inside the machine that was now camped 40 kilometers away. That knowledge, combined with the political crisis that made hesitation its own form of defeat, would define everything that happened next. To understand why Marathon was even possible, you have to understand what a hoplite was, and what it meant to fight as one. The word hoplite comes from hoplon, the large round shield that defined the soldier who carried it. But the hoplon was only one piece of a complete weapon system that had evolved over roughly 2 centuries of Greek warfare. A fully equipped hoplite in 490 BC carried and wore the following: the aspis, a circular shield approximately 90 centimeters in diameter, made of wood and faced with bronze, weighing between 7 and 9 kilograms. The doru, a thrusting spear between 2 and 3 meters long with an iron tip at the front and a bronze spike at the rear called the sarator, which could be driven into the ground for stability or used as a secondary weapon if the spear shaft broke. The xiphos, a short iron sword worn on the left hip as a backup weapon. A bronze or leather corselet protecting the torso. Bronze greaves protecting the shins. And a helmet, most commonly of the Corinthian type, which enclosed the entire head, leaving only a narrow opening for the eyes and mouth. The total weight of this equipment was somewhere between 20 and 30 kilograms. A hoplite went into battle carrying the equivalent of a large suitcase strapped to his body, in bronze, in the September heat of the Attic Plain. What made this equipment effective was not the individual soldier, but the formation. The hoplites fought in a phalanx, a tight rectangular block of men, typically 8 ranks deep, standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping. Each man's shield protected not only his own left side, but the right side of the man standing next to him. This created an interlocking wall of bronze that was extraordinarily difficult to penetrate from the front. The physics of phalanx combat were straightforward. 2 phalanxes meeting head-on would attempt to push through each other, using the weight of their entire formation. The rear ranks pressing into the backs of the men in front, driving the whole mass forward in what the Greeks called the othismos, the push. The front rank fought with spears at close range, and when spears broke, with swords. The goal was to break the cohesion of the opposing formation, to create a gap, to cause men to step back or turn away, because once a phalanx started to dissolve, it dissolved rapidly, and the casualties during the pursuit were typically far higher than during the main engagement. The critical vulnerability of the phalanx was its flanks. The formation was strong from the front, but exposed on the sides. A unit that found its flank turned, meaning an enemy had gotten around the end of the line and was attacking from the side, was in serious danger because the overlapping shields provided no protection against a lateral attack. Every Greek general understood this. Every battle plan was partly about protecting your own flanks and trying to turn the enemy's. The Persian military system was built on entirely different principles. Its core strength was ranged combat, specifically the massed use of archers who could deliver enormous volumes of arrows at enemy formations before they closed to melee range. Persian infantry was lighter, faster, and more flexible than Greek hoplites. Persian cavalry was used aggressively to exploit gaps in enemy lines and to pursue and destroy broken formations. The Persian approach was to wear down an enemy from a distance, disrupt their formation, create chaos, and then move in for the close quarters kill. Against most of the armies Persia had faced, this system worked exceptionally well. Against the heavy bronze wall of a Greek phalanx, closing with discipline at speed, the calculation was different. But it required the Greeks to actually close that distance before the archers could tear them apart. Running across an open field into a wall of Persian arrows, in full armor, was not something that happened naturally. It required specific tactical decisions and a level of collective nerve that was genuinely extraordinary. This tension, the Persian ranged system against the Greek shock system, was the central military problem of Marathon, and Miltiades understood it better than any other man alive. When the Persian fleet landed at Marathon, Athens faced an immediate political and military crisis that operated on 2 levels simultaneously. The military level was obvious. A large, experienced, well-equipped enemy force had landed on Attic soil and needed to be dealt with. But the political level was equally urgent. Athens in 490 BC was a democracy only 20 years old. The reforms of Cleisthenes in 508–507 BC had dismantled the old aristocratic power structures and created a system of popular government that was still finding its institutional footing. The city was full of political factions, personal rivalries, and men whose loyalty to the democratic system was conditional on whether it served their interests. One of those men was Hippias, the exiled tyrant who was traveling with the Persian fleet, waiting for his city to fall so he could be reinstalled as ruler. Hippias had contacts inside Athens. He had family, clients, and political allies who might prefer a restored tyranny under Persian patronage to the current democratic arrangement. The threat was not only the Persian army on the plain, it was the possibility of the city surrendering or being betrayed from within before the army even fought. Athens's military command structure in this period was a board of 10 strategoi, generals, one elected from each of the 10 Athenian tribes created by Cleisthenes' reforms. These 10 men held equal authority. Above them, technically, sat the polmarchos, the war archon, a magistrate whose role had originally been the overall military commander of Athens, but whose power had been gradually reduced as the role of the strategoi expanded. In 490 BC, the polmarchos was a man named Callimachus of Aphidna. When the 10 generals assembled to decide what to do, they were divided. 5 favored marching to Marathon and engaging the Persians. 5 favored remaining in Athens, staying behind the city's walls, and waiting for the Spartans to arrive. The arguments for waiting were not without logic. The city walls provided a significant defensive advantage. The Spartan army was the finest fighting force in Greece. If the Athenians could hold out for a few more days, they would have reinforcements of genuine quality. Engaging the Persians immediately, at a disadvantage in numbers without Spartan support, on open ground against a force that included cavalry, was an enormous risk. Miltiades argued against waiting with a directness that Herodotus preserves in some detail. His core argument was political as much as military. Every day of inaction allowed fear to grow inside the city. Delay gave the faction that wanted to surrender, or to open the gates for Hippias, more time to organize, and more psychological ammunition to work with. The longer the Athenians waited behind their walls watching an enormous Persian army sit on their doorstep, the more the idea of resistance would start to seem futile to ordinary citizens. The Persians understood this dynamic, and may have been counting on it. Their strategy for dealing with Greek cities frequently involved a combination of military demonstration and internal subversion, and it had worked at Eretria just days before. The vote was 5-5. Miltiades turned to Callimachus. The speech Herodotus attributes to Miltiades at this moment is one of the more striking pieces of political rhetoric in the ancient sources. He told Callimachus that it was in his hands whether Athens would be enslaved or free, and that his name would be remembered alongside the great benefactors of the city if he voted to fight. Whether this is a verbatim record or Herodotus's reconstruction of the argument is impossible to know. What is certain is the outcome. Callimachus voted to fight. The decision was made. Athens would march to Marathon. Even with the decision made, Athens moved immediately to secure whatever allied support it could. The most important ally to contact was Sparta. The Spartans maintained the most feared land army in Greece, the professional, full-time soldier class called the Spartiates, trained from childhood in the Agage, the brutal educational system that produced warriors of exceptional discipline and collective cohesion. Spartan infantry in a phalanx was widely considered the standard against which all Greek military forces were measured. If any Greek force could stand alongside the Athenians against Persia and make the numerical deficit manageable, it was Sparta. Athens sent a runner to Sparta to request immediate military assistance. The man chosen was Phidippides, described in the sources as a trained long-distance runner, a hemerodromos, literally a day runner, a specialist in covering enormous distances at sustained speed. The distance from Athens to Sparta is approximately 240 kilometers across difficult terrain. Herodotus says Phidippides arrived in Sparta the day after he left Athens. Whether this is precisely accurate, or a rounding of the actual time, it represents an extraordinary physical performance under conditions of genuine urgency. The Spartan response was not a refusal. The Spartans said they wanted to help, and the ancient sources generally portray this as sincere rather than evasive. But they were in the middle of the festival of the Carneia, a sacred religious festival during which Spartan law prohibited military campaigning. The festival would end with the full moon, which was still several days away. The Spartans said they would march as soon as the festival concluded. This meant they would not arrive in time for whatever was about to happen at Marathon. Athens sent additional requests to other Greek cities. The response was almost universally negative or non-committal. The city of Argos, a traditional rival of Sparta, reportedly refused because of existing hostility toward Athens or Sparta or both. Most other cities either did not respond or sent gestures of sympathy without soldiers. The one exception was Plataea. Plataea was a small city in Boeotia, the region directly north of Attica, with a population and military capacity that was a fraction of Athens's. It had a history of close relationship with Athens. In approximately 519 BC, the Plataeans had sought Athenian protection against pressure from Thebes, and Athens had accepted, creating a bond of alliance that the Plataeans took seriously. When the call came, Plataea sent its entire military levy, approximately 1,000 hoplites, and marched them to Marathon. 1,000 soldiers was not a number that changed the fundamental strategic equation, but it was something. It filled a section of the Greek line. It demonstrated that Athens was not entirely alone. And from the perspective of the Plataeans themselves, it was an act of genuine courage. A small city marching its entire army into a confrontation with the Persian Empire because an ally had asked for help. The Greeks positioned their camp at Marathon in the hills at the edge of the plain, between two rivers, using the terrain to protect their flanks and limit the area over which Persian cavalry could maneuver. For several days, neither side moved. The two armies sat and watched each other across the plain. The standoff at Marathon lasted several days, and historians have debated ever since exactly why. From the Greek perspective, the reasons for hesitation are understandable. The Persian force was large, it included cavalry, and attacking across open ground meant exposure to both cavalry flanking movements and massed arrow fire before contact. The Greeks were waiting either for a tactical opportunity, a moment when Persian cavalry was absent or their formation was vulnerable, or for the Spartan reinforcements that might still arrive if the situation held. From the Persian perspective, the delay is more interesting and more debated. One explanation is that the Persians were waiting for their Athenian collaborators, the internal faction that wanted to surrender or open the city, to act. The destruction of Eretria was fresh in Greek memory. If the Persians could take Athens without a costly frontal assault, through internal betrayal as had happened at Eretria, that was a preferable outcome. Fighting a disciplined Greek phalanx on ground where cavalry could not be fully deployed was a risk worth avoiding if the city might fall from within. There is an episode in the ancient sources that bears on this directly, though it remains one of the most disputed questions in the scholarship on Marathon. Herodotus mentions that after the battle, someone held up a shield on a hilltop in a way that could be seen by the Persian fleet, apparently a signal. The gesture was interpreted at the time as a communication from Persian sympathizers inside Attica, letting the fleet know that the moment was right to sail around the Attic Peninsula and attack an undefended Athens while the army was occupied at Marathon. The identity of who gave the signal was never established with certainty. Ancient sources and later historians pointed at the Alcmaeonid family, a powerful Athenian aristocratic clan. But this accusation was strongly contested in antiquity and remains unresolved. What the shield signal episode reveals, regardless of its ultimate explanation, is the degree to which Marathon was not simply a military engagement between two armies. It was fought inside a city gripped by political fear, where the loyalty of powerful internal factions was uncertain, and where the Persian strategy was as much about psychological pressure and internal subversion as about battlefield tactics. The Greeks were not only fighting the army on the plain, they were fighting the temptation to surrender. Every day the Persian camp sat there, enormous and unhurried, was another day the arguments for giving up got easier to make and harder to answer. Miltiades understood this better than anyone. The delay that seemed like caution was actually the most dangerous thing the Greeks could do, not because of what the Persians would do to them on the battlefield, but because of what the waiting would do to them from the inside. The moment Miltiades had been waiting for came when the Persian cavalry disappeared from the plain. On the morning of the battle, most likely in mid-September of 490 BC, though the exact date remains debated, the Persian cavalry was not visible on the plain. This is the operational pivot on which the entire battle turns. and it requires some explanation because the absence of cavalry at Marathon is one of the most discussed tactical questions in ancient military history. The Persian cavalry had been present at Marathon throughout the standoff period. Their horses needed water, grazing, and rest. The plain of Marathon had streams and grassland that could support them, but maintaining a large cavalry force in the field for an extended period created logistical demands. Some ancient sources and modern scholars have suggested that the cavalry was in the process of being re-embarked onto the fleet, that the Persian command had decided to load the horses back onto the transport ships and sail around Cape Sunion to attack Athens directly, while the army held the Greek force at Marathon. Others suggest the cavalry was simply out of position, having moved to water or graze, and would return. The ancient source that mentions the cavalry's absence most clearly is a later Byzantine lexicon called the Suda, which contains the phrase, "the cavalry are away," hippies aphiasi, attributed to Ionian Greeks who were supposedly serving in the Persian force, and passed this information to the Athenians as a warning or signal. Whether this transmission of information actually happened, or whether Miltiades simply observed the cavalry's absence himself from his elevated position in the hills, the practical reality was the same. The Greek generals looked out at the plain of Marathon, and the Persian cavalry was not deployed in its normal position. This was the window. Miltiades understood the tactical geometry clearly. Without cavalry covering the Persian flanks and ready to pursue and destroy a retreating or disorganized Greek force, the fundamental threat calculation changed. The hoplite phalanx was designed for exactly this kind of engagement, a frontal collision between infantry formations on open ground. The Persian archers were still dangerous, but the distance the Greeks needed to cover under arrow fire could be reduced by moving fast. The cavalry that would have made pursuit of any Greek disorder catastrophic was not there. The decision to attack was made. Callimachus, as Polemarchos, held the right wing, the position of honor in a Greek battle line. The Plataeans took the left wing. The 10 Athenian tribal contingents filled the center and portions of the flanks according to their tribal order. Miltiades commanded with the authority the other generals had, by this point, deferred to him, though the exact command structure remains a matter of historical debate. The Greek line formed up and began to move across the plain toward the Persian camp. Before examining what happened on the field, the tactical plan itself needs to be understood because it was not obvious, not safe, and not the kind of thing a cautious commander would attempt. The standard Greek phalanx formation of the period was deployed in roughly equal depth across the entire width of the line. Typically, 8 ranks deep from front to back, the formation presented a uniform front to the enemy. This was tactically straightforward. You lined up, you advanced, you pushed, and the stronger or more disciplined force won. Miltiades did not do this. He deliberately thinned the center of the Greek line, reducing its depth, placing fewer men in the central tribal contingents, while reinforcing the 2 wings. The exact numbers are not recorded with precision in the ancient sources, but the tactical intention is clear. Miltiades was creating a formation that was weaker in the middle than on the sides, by design, against an enemy that outnumbered him. This requires a moment of reflection. Miltiades was about to attack a larger force with a formation that had a deliberately weakened center. If the center broke, not just bent, but actually broke, with men turning and running, the battle would be lost instantly. A gap in the center of a phalanx during close combat was catastrophic. It exposed the flanks of both wings, invited the enemy to pour through, and typically produced a complete collapse. Every Greek soldier who had ever trained understood this. Thinning your center was not a recognized tactical option. It was a mistake you tried to avoid. Except that Miltiades was not trying to win with his center. He was using his center as bait. The logic worked like this. The Persians would push hardest where the Greek line was weakest, because that is what any competent force does. The weakened center would give ground, slowly, under discipline, not breaking but retreating under pressure, while the reinforced Greek wings crushed the Persian wings on both sides. Once the wings had defeated the Persian flanks, they would turn inward toward the center, attacking the Persian force that had pushed through from both sides simultaneously. The Persians who thought they were advancing through a broken center would find themselves surrounded. This maneuver, the double envelopment, the pincer movement, the encirclement by converging wings, is one of the most celebrated tactical concepts in military history. Its most famous later application was at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal of Carthage used a nearly identical concept to destroy a Roman army twice his size. Military historians have studied and debated both battles for centuries. The principle was not invented at Marathon. It appears in earlier engagements. But Marathon is the clearest early historical example of its deliberate, planned application in a major engagement. What made Miltiades capable of conceiving this plan was precisely what made him unusual among Athenian commanders. He knew how Persian infantry fought. He knew they were aggressive in pushing forward when they sensed weakness. He knew their formation lacked the rigid lateral discipline of a Greek phalanx and would not easily adjust to a changing situation on the flanks. He knew that if the Persian center advanced too far and the wings collapsed, their forward momentum would become a liability. They would be deep inside the Greek formation, cut off from retreat, with enemies on three sides. He was designing a trap. And the trap depended on the Persian army fighting exactly as well as it normally did. The distance between the Greek position at the edge of the hills and the Persian camp at the far end of the plain was approximately 1 mile, around 1,500 meters by most reconstructions, though estimates vary. The Greeks crossed at least part of this distance at a run. Herodotus is explicit on this point. The Athenians were the first Greeks he knows of to charge at a run against an enemy, and he notes that the Persians watching them approach thought they were mad, that men running at a full army in full armor must be either suicidal or deranged. The Greek equipment weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms. Running a significant distance in bronze armor in September heat before engaging in close quarters combat was a serious physical demand. The Greeks who ran at Marathon were doing something genuinely extraordinary in terms of physical exertion alone. The tactical reason for the run is debated among historians, but the most widely accepted explanation connects directly to the Persian archery threat. Persian archers were most effective at medium range, the distance at which they could aim accurately and deliver sustained volley fire into a packed formation. At very close range, the Greek shields provided substantial protection, and the Persians had no room to shoot without hitting their own men. The fastest way to minimize the time spent inside the killing zone of effective archery was to minimize the time spent at that range, which meant moving through it as quickly as possible. A second explanation involves the cavalry. Even if the cavalry was absent when the Greeks began their advance, there was no guarantee it would remain absent. Moving fast across the plain reduced the window during which a returning cavalry force could deploy against the Greek flanks before contact was made. Whatever the specific combination of reasons, the run was a decision of real tactical intelligence. It compressed the timeline of the engagement, reduced the effectiveness of the primary Persian ranged weapon, and brought the Greek shock system, the phalanx, into contact with the Persian line before the Persians had time to fully adjust their formation or bring up reserves. The Persians had never seen this before. Every army they had faced had either met them at a walk, giving the archers maximum time to work, or had waited in a defensive position for the Persians to advance. The sight of a formed Greek phalanx coming across the plain at a run, shields locked, spears leveled, was something outside their operational experience. The two formations collided. The initial collision between a Greek phalanx and Persian infantry was a physical shock of considerable violence. The front rank of the phalanx hit the opposing line with the combined momentum of 8 ranks of men pushing from behind, each man's shield driving into the man in front of him, the entire mass moving as a compressed unit. Persian infantry, lighter and less heavily armored, took the impact of this collision at a significant disadvantage. In the early stages of the battle, the Persian line held. The Persians were experienced soldiers with their own discipline and their own fighting traditions. They pushed back against the Greek center where the line was thinnest. The central tribal contingents of the Athenian phalanx, the deliberately weakened section, began to give ground. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire battle. The men in the center knew their line was bending. They could feel the pressure from in front increasing, and the density of their own formation thinning as men fell, or as the line spread to compensate. The natural reaction for any infantry soldier in this situation is to turn and run, because a phalanx that is retreating under pressure is already on the edge of dissolution. Once men start stepping back individually, The formation loses its collective shield wall, and what was a military unit becomes a crowd of individuals running away, at which point the casualties are catastrophic, because a pursuing enemy kills fleeing men far more efficiently than engaged ones. The center did not break. This is the discipline point that does not receive enough emphasis in popular accounts of Marathon. Miltiades' plan only worked if the center retreated in good order, giving ground deliberately, maintaining formation, keeping their shields up and their lines intact, without dissolving into a rout. The men in the center had to trust that the wings were winning, that the plan was working, that their job was to absorb pressure rather than deliver it, and that help was coming from the sides. They had to do this while Persian soldiers were pushing into them, killing the men around them, and driving them backward across ground they had just crossed. They held. On both wings, the situation was developing as Miltiades had designed. The reinforced Athenian and Plataean flanks, meeting Persian forces that were thinner and less heavily armored, pushed through. The Persian wings were not simply defeated. They were rolled up quickly, with the momentum of the Greek advance carrying the flanking formations around the ends of the Persian line, before the Persians could adjust their formation to respond. When both Greek wings had defeated their opposing Persian flanks, Miltiades' plan entered its decisive phase. Rather than pursuing the fleeing Persian wing soldiers toward the beach, which would have been the instinctive response and which would have broken the formation apart into a disordered pursuit, the Greek wings turned inward. They wheeled toward the center of the battlefield, where the Persian main body had pushed through the weakened Greek center and was now advancing with confidence, apparently believing they were on the verge of breaking the Greek line entirely. The Persians in the center had no awareness of what had happened on the flanks. Their line of sight was the immediate combat in front of them. They knew they were advancing. They knew the Greeks in front of them were giving ground. They did not know, could not easily know in the noise and dust and chaos of ancient battle, that the soldiers to their left and right had already been defeated, and that two Greek formations were now closing on them from both sides. The moment of realization, when it came, would have been sudden and catastrophic. The Greek wings closed in on the Persian center from both sides simultaneously. The Persians who had advanced through the Greek center found themselves in a narrowing corridor of enemies. Greeks in front of them, who had stopped retreating and were now pushing forward again, and Greeks on both sides closing the gap. The Persian formation, which had been advancing with momentum, had no space to maneuver, no room to reform, and no clear direction of retreat. This is the tactical condition that produces not just defeat, but destruction. An army that is surrounded and compressed cannot fight effectively, cannot communicate commands, cannot bring its full strength to bear at any one point, and cannot retreat in order. It collapses inward. Units lose cohesion. Individual survival instinct overrides collective discipline. Men stop fighting as a formation and start trying to get out individually. The Persian center broke. The collapse of the Persian center triggered a general retreat toward the beach where the fleet was anchored. What had been an organized Persian formation became a mass of men moving in the same direction, toward the water, toward the ships, toward escape. The Greek phalanx pursued. This phase of the battle, the pursuit, was where ancient engagements typically produced their highest casualties, because men running away cannot defend themselves effectively, and pursuing soldiers kill with far less risk than in close formation combat. The terrain worked against the Persians. The plain of Marathon slopes toward the beach through an area that in antiquity included marshy ground near the shore. Some Persian soldiers, trying to reach the ships by the most direct route, ran into the marsh. The Greek pursuit pressed from behind. Men died in the water as well as on the land. The killing continued until the Persian soldiers reached the ships and the ships began to move off the beach. At the water's edge, the battle became a fight for the ships themselves. The Greeks, recognizing that any Persian ship they allowed to depart would carry soldiers who could be used against Athens, attempted to seize or destroy as many vessels as possible. This brought them into direct combat at the shoreline, fighting men on ships, fighting men trying to board ships, fighting the rearguard units that the Persian command had organized to cover the evacuation. It was here that Callimachus died. The Polemarchos, who had cast the deciding vote that sent Athens to Marathon, who had held the position of honor on the right wing throughout the battle, was killed in the fighting at the ships. The ancient sources differ on the precise circumstances of his death. Some describe him falling at the ships, others place his death earlier in the battle. But he did not survive the day. The man whose decision had made the battle possible paid for it with his life. The Greeks captured 7 Persian ships. It was a relatively small number out of the total fleet, but it was a tangible physical prize, proof of victory that went beyond body counts. 7 Persian warships sitting on the beach at Marathon was evidence that could not be argued with. The rest of the Persian fleet pushed off from the shore and moved south around the Attic Peninsula. Herodotus records the casualties with a specificity that is striking even by modern standards. The Athenians lost 192 men. The Plataeans lost an unknown number. The sources do not give a figure. The Persians lost 6,400. The Athenian number is not a rough estimate. The 192 dead were buried individually in the Soros, the burial mound that still stands on the plain of Marathon today, and their names were recorded. We know that among the dead was Callimachus. We know that a man named Stesilaos died there. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD, says the names of the fallen were inscribed on stone stelae at the site. The specificity of the Athenian number reflects the fact that these were known individuals, citizens with families, men whose deaths were formally recorded by a democratic state that took its obligations to its fallen seriously. The Persian number, 6,400, is taken from Herodotus and cannot be independently verified. Modern historians treat it with appropriate caution. Ancient battle casualty figures are frequently exaggerated, particularly for the losing side, and Herodotus was writing several decades after the battle from sources that included Athenian veterans with an obvious interest in the most favorable account. The actual Persian dead may have been lower, but even allowing for significant exaggeration, the disparity in casualties reflects the fundamental dynamics of what happened. The envelopment tactic concentrated Greek combat power against portions of the Persian force at a time, and in a configuration where the Persians could not effectively respond. The pursuit phase, as it almost always did in ancient warfare, added substantially to the Persian total, and the Greeks, fighting in formation with superior armor, fighting men who were trying to flee rather than fighting back, were far more efficient killers in that phase than in the initial collision. The ratio of roughly 1 Greek dead to 33 Persian dead is not a number that requires miracle or myth to explain. It is the predictable outcome of a well-executed encirclement against an army that, once its formation broke, had nowhere to go. The Persian fleet did not anchor off Marathon and wait to see what happened next. The ships moved south around Cape Sunion, the southernmost tip of Attica, with the apparent intention of sailing up the western coast and landing at Phalerum, the harbor closest to Athens, before the Greek army could return from Marathon. This was the second phase of the Persian plan, and it very nearly worked. The Greek army, having fought a battle, pursued an enemy to the sea, fought at the shoreline, and then stood on a beach watching the Persian fleet disappear around the Cape, was now required to cover approximately 40 kilometers back to Athens. In full armor, in September heat, without rest. They did it. Herodotus says the Athenians marched back to Athens at speed and reached the city before the Persian fleet arrived at Phalerum. The Persian commanders, finding the army they had just defeated at Marathon standing ready on the Athenian shore, decided not to land. After remaining offshore for a period, they sailed away east toward Persia. Athens had held. Now, the story of Pheidippides and the run from Marathon to Athens, the origin of the modern marathon race, requires careful handling, because the version most people know is not what Herodotus actually records. Herodotus does not describe a runner carrying news of victory from the battlefield to Athens who then died upon arrival. This story does not appear in Herodotus at all. The famous run, one man, alone, running from Marathon to Athens, saying, "We won," and dying, appears first in the work of the writer Lucian, writing roughly 6 centuries after the battle, and is likely a later literary construction, rather than a historical record. What Herodotus does describe is Pheidippides' earlier run to Sparta, the 240-kilometer journey to request Spartan aid, and a story in which Pheidippides encountered the god Pan in the mountains during that run, who asked why the Athenians did not worship him. This encounter was taken seriously enough that the Athenians subsequently established a cult of Pan beneath the Acropolis. The modern marathon race, 42.195 kilometers, was established at the 1896 Athens Olympics as a commemoration of the battle, with the distance approximating the route from Marathon to Athens. The distance was standardized at its current length at the 1908 London Olympics. The race is real. The specific story it commemorates, one dying runner carrying news of victory, is almost certainly not. What is real is this. The Athenian army, after fighting one of the most consequential battles in Western history, walked home in armor and saved their city a second time on the same day. The Persian fleet that sailed away from the Athenian coast in September of 490 BC did not carry a defeated empire. It carried a humiliated one. And there is a meaningful difference between the two. Darius I returned to Persia facing a political and symbolic problem of considerable magnitude. The Achaemenid Empire's authority rested in large part on the perception of its invincibility. Conquered peoples paid tribute and stayed conquered partly because resistance seemed futile. Subject kings and satraps remained loyal, partly because defiance appeared suicidal. Every time Persia sent an army somewhere, and the army returned without completing its objective, that perception eroded slightly. Marathon was not a minor border skirmish. It was a full expeditionary force, assembled with deliberate purpose, sent to punish specific cities for specific acts, and it had failed. The cities it was sent to punish were still standing. One of them had killed over 6,000 Persian soldiers and captured 7 Persian warships. Darius's response was exactly what a ruler of his experience and capability would be expected to produce. He began planning a larger invasion. The scale of what he intended was categorically different from the 490 BC expedition. Rather than a punitive raid designed to chastise Athens and Eretria, Darius now planned the full conquest of the Greek mainland. This meant assembling an army and fleet that could not simply be defeated by one clever tactical maneuver on one plane. It meant solving the logistical problems that had wrecked Mardonius's fleet at Mount Athos in 492 BC. It meant organizing the largest military expedition the ancient world had yet seen. The preparations took years. Herodotus describes Darius sending heralds throughout the empire demanding earth and water, the symbolic tokens of submission, from cities and peoples across the known world. He ordered the construction of additional ships, the stockpiling of provisions, the assembly of contingents from every corner of the empire. The scope of the project was imperial in the fullest sense. This was not one general with one army. This was the organized military capacity of a dominion stretching from Central Asia to North Africa, being directed at a peninsula the size of a moderate Persian province. Darius did not live to launch this invasion. In 486 BC, 4 years after Marathon, Egypt revolted against Persian rule. Managing the Egyptian rebellion took priority over the Greek expedition. Before Darius could resolve both crises and return to his Greek plans, he died. The exact circumstances and cause of his death are not recorded with precision in the ancient sources, but he died in late 486 BC, after a reign of approximately 36 years. He was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. The oath of revenge against Athens passed to his son. Xerxes. I was not the obvious heir to the Achaemenid throne. Darius had sons from an earlier marriage who were older than Xerxes, but Xerxes was the son of Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the empire, which gave him a dynastic legitimacy that outweighed simple birth order. He came to power in late 486 BC and spent his first years dealing with the Egyptian revolt and a subsequent rebellion in Babylon before turning his full attention to Greece. What he built for the Greek invasion of 480 BC was, by any ancient measure, staggering. Herodotus's figures for the Persian force at the Hellespont in 480 BC, over 5 million men in total, including support personnel, are universally dismissed by modern historians as wildly exaggerated. Ancient authors routinely inflated enemy numbers to magnify the significance of Greek victories. Modern estimates for the actual Persian combat force at the Hellespont range from around 100,000 to 300,000 soldiers, with a fleet of perhaps 600 to 800 warships. Even at the lower end of these estimates, It was the largest military force that had ever been directed at Greece. Xerxes solved the Mount Athos problem by cutting a canal through the peninsula, an engineering project that Herodotus describes in detail, and that modern archaeology has confirmed actually existed. He bridged the Hellespont with 2 pontoon bridges made of boats lashed together, allowing his army to walk from Asia into Europe across the water. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes famously ordered the water to be whipped and chains thrown into it as punishment, an episode that ancient writers used to characterize him as arrogant and irrational, though the political theater of the gesture was more likely calculated than impulsive. The invasion of 480 BC produced 3 of the most famous military engagements in ancient history. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans under Leonidas and their allies held a narrow coastal pass for 3 days against the full Persian army before being outflanked and destroyed. Salamis, where the Greek fleet under Themistocles lured the Persian navy into a confined strait and destroyed it in a single afternoon. And Plataea in 479 BC, where the Greek land forces under Spartan command finally destroyed the Persian army on Greek soil and ended the invasion permanently. None of these battles would have happened the way they did without Marathon. The 10 years between 490 and 480 BC were spent by Athens preparing for exactly what came. And that preparation, the ships, the alliances, the political will, traced directly back to what had happened on the plain of Marathon and to the men who shaped Athenian policy in its aftermath. The man who had designed the victory at Marathon did not enjoy its fruits for long. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Miltiades was at the peak of his political prestige. He had been right when others had counseled caution. He had designed a plan that succeeded precisely as intended. He had saved Athens. The democratic assembly that had acquitted him of tyranny charges when he first returned from the Chersonese now looked at him as the city's deliverer. He used this prestige to request something substantial. In 489 BC, less than a year after Marathon, Miltiades approached the Athenian assembly and asked for 70 ships, an army, and full discretionary authority over a military expedition to an undisclosed destination. He told the assembly the expedition would make Athens rich, that he knew of a place where they could acquire great wealth, but he refused to specify where he was going. He asked the Athenians to trust him based on his record. The assembly gave him what he asked for. The destination was Paros, a wealthy island in the Cyclades that had supplied a ship to the Persian fleet in 490 BC. Whether Miltiades' primary motivation was punishing Persian collaboration, acquiring personal wealth, settling old scores, he apparently had a personal grievance against a Parian citizen who had given information to the Persians during the campaign. Or some combination of all 3 is not entirely clear from the sources. What is clear is that the expedition was a comprehensive failure. Miltiades arrived at Paros with his fleet and demanded a large sum of silver from the island as compensation for their support of Persia. When the Parians refused, he began a siege. The siege dragged on for 26 days without result. The island's walls held. No significant progress was made. According to Herodotus, Miltiades attempted a night operation involving the sanctuary of Demeter on a hill outside the city walls. The exact nature of what he was attempting is unclear, possibly some kind of ritual or signaling operation, and in the process suffered a serious injury to his thigh, either from a fall or from some other mishap at the sanctuary. With his thigh injured, the siege going nowhere, and his provisions presumably running low, Miltiades ordered the fleet back to Athens. He returned to the city that had trusted him with 70 ships and an army and an open-ended mandate, having accomplished nothing, having spent significant public resources, and having injured himself in circumstances that the sources describe with a degree of vagueness that itself suggests something embarrassing had occurred. His political enemies moved immediately. The man who led the prosecution was Xanthippus, an Athenian politician and the father of the future statesman Pericles, which gives the episode a peculiar dynastic irony. Xanthippus charged Miltiades with deceiving the Athenian people, a serious charge under Athenian law that carried the death penalty. The trial was held before the full assembly. Miltiades could not speak in his own defense. His thigh wound had become severely infected. The ancient sources describe it as gangrenous, and he was carried into the assembly on a litter, unable to stand. His friends spoke for him. They reminded the assembly of Marathon. They invoked his service to the city, his record, his victory over the greatest empire in the world. The assembly did not vote for the death penalty, but it did not acquit him either. Miltiades was fined 50 talents, a sum representing an enormous amount of money, roughly equivalent to several years of income for a wealthy family. The fine was specifically set at the amount the expedition had cost the public treasury. He could not pay it. Under Athenian law, a man who could not pay a fine to the state remained imprisoned until the debt was settled. Miltiades died in prison while his thigh wound was still open and infected. The date is not precisely recorded, but it was within weeks of the trial, in 489 BC. His son Cimon eventually paid off the debt, which allowed his father's body to be released for proper burial. The man who had saved Athens from Persian conquest died in an Athenian prison, convicted of deceiving the people he had preserved, unable to speak in his own defense because of a wound suffered on a failed expedition he had launched at the height of his own prestige. The historical irony is almost too complete to seem real, but it is thoroughly documented and undisputed. While the politics of Athens moved on and Miltiades died in prison, the plain of Marathon retained its own form of permanence. The 192 Athenians who died in the battle were not brought home. This was exceptional. Greek tradition held that the bodies of soldiers killed in battle should be returned to their families for burial in their home city. The funeral rites and burial within the family plot were not merely sentimental. They were religious obligations with real significance in Greek belief about the afterlife and the proper relationship between the living and the dead. The decision to bury the Marathon dead on the battlefield was a deliberate civic and religious statement. These men were given a collective burial mound, the Soros, on the site where they fell. The mound was constructed over their bodies, and the names of the dead were recorded, likely on stone markers at or near the site. They were honored not as private individuals returned to their families, but as public heroes, sacrificed in a communal act that the entire city claimed. The Soros stands today. It is one of the best preserved ancient burial mounds in Greece, rising approximately 10 meters above the plain. Archaeological excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries confirmed that it contains cremated human remains consistent with a mass burial. The Greeks cremated their dead before interment, along with pottery and other material consistent with a late archaic date, specifically the late 6th or early 5th century BC. The archaeology matches Herodotus's account with a precision that is unusual for events of this antiquity. Each year after Marathon, the Athenians held a public ceremony at the Soros. Herodotus, who wrote approximately 50 years after the battle, says that in his own time the area of Marathon was considered sacred, and that the spirits of the men who died there were believed to still be present on the plain. Local inhabitants reported hearing the sounds of horses and fighting on the battlefield at night, an account that reflects the degree to which Marathon had entered Athenian religious and cultural life as something that transcended ordinary history. 10 years after Marathon, when the Persian army under Xerxes burned Athens and its temples during the invasion of 480 BC, the Athenians who had evacuated the city carried their most important sacred objects and documents with them. Among the things they preserved was the memory of what the 192 had done and the debt the city owed them. The decade between Marathon and the Second Persian invasion was not a period of Athenian complacency. It was one of the most consequential periods of political and military development in the city's history. The dominant figure of this decade was Themistocles, an Athenian politician of unusual strategic vision who drew a conclusion from Marathon that was not immediately obvious to his contemporaries. The conclusion was this: Marathon had been won on land, but the next Persian invasion would come by sea, and Athens could not win a land battle against the force Persia was assembling. The city needed a navy. Themistocles argued for using a windfall of silver from the newly discovered mines at Laurion, a find of exceptional richness that had initially been proposed for distribution directly to Athenian citizens, to build a fleet of 200 triremes. The trireme was the dominant warship of the Mediterranean world, a long, narrow, oar-powered vessel designed for ramming and maneuver, requiring a crew of around 170 men, and capable of extraordinary speed and agility in skilled hands. The political fight over the silver was significant. Distributing the money directly to citizens was popular. Building ships was expensive, and the benefit was less immediate and less personal. Themistocles won the argument. The ships were built. Athens entered the campaign of 480 BC with a fleet that became the decisive instrument of Greek survival at Salamis. None of this happened automatically as a consequence of Marathon. It required specific political choices, specific men making specific arguments, a democratic assembly voting in specific ways. But the psychological foundation for all of it was Marathon. The demonstrated fact that Persia could be beaten, that Greek soldiers in Greek formations could defeat the imperial military machine, that resistance was not futile. Without that demonstrated fact, the argument for building ships to fight the next Persian invasion, rather than negotiating terms of surrender, would have been much harder to make and much harder to win. Marathon did not save Greece by itself, but it created the conditions under which Greece could be saved. When the Spartan army finally arrived at Marathon, 2,000 soldiers, marching at full speed after the Carneia festival ended, they found the battle already over. Herodotus says they asked to see the Persian dead. They walked the battlefield, looked at the bodies, praised the Athenians, and went home. It is a small detail, but it carries weight. The finest soldiers in Greece came to Marathon after the fact and examined what the Athenians had done. The implicit acknowledgement in that gesture, Spartans, who considered themselves the standard of Greek military excellence, traveling to inspect an Athenian victory over the force they had declined to face in time, reflected a shift in the balance of Greek military prestige that had lasting consequences. Before Marathon, Athens was a significant city, but not a military power of the first rank. Its army had never fought a major engagement against a foreign imperial force. Its democratic system was young and untested under genuine pressure. Its claim to leadership among Greek states rested on cultural and commercial weight, more than on demonstrated military capability. After Marathon, Athens was something different. It had faced the Persian Empire alone, with one small allied contingent, and destroyed it on the battlefield. It had done so using a tactical plan of genuine sophistication, executed with the discipline and collective nerve that military success of that kind requires. The city that had been targeted for destruction as an example to the rest of Greece had instead become the example of something else entirely. That resistance worked, that Persian soldiers died like anyone else, and that a free citizen army fighting for its own city could defeat a professional imperial force fighting for someone else's empire. The psychological effect on the broader Greek world was real and measurable. Cities that had been calculating whether to submit to Persian demands or resist them now had a data point they had not previously possessed. Persia was not invincible. The calculation of resistance versus submission shifted, even if only slightly, in the direction of resistance. This shift was not sufficient on its own to unify Greece. Greek disunity remained a persistent structural problem through the Persian Wars and beyond. But it made the coalition that eventually formed against Xerxes in 480 BC politically possible in a way it might not have been without Marathon. The tactical innovation at Marathon, the deliberate double envelopment, the weakened center used as a controlled trap, the use of speed to neutralize ranged weapons, entered the intellectual tradition of Western military thought as a foundational reference point. Military historians and theorists from antiquity through the modern period have returned to Marathon repeatedly. The battle appears in the military writings of ancient authors, in Renaissance discussions of ancient warfare, in the curriculum of modern military academies. It is studied not as a curiosity, but as a genuine example of tactical thinking that solved a real problem in an original way under conditions of extreme pressure. The specific maneuver Miltiades employed, using superior wing strength to envelop an enemy whose center has advanced too far, became one of the canonical examples of what military theory calls the battle of encirclement, or the double envelopment. Hannibal used a version of it at Cannae in 216 BC to destroy a Roman army of approximately 70,000 men. The German general Alfred von Schlieffen studied Cannae in the 19th century and developed the Schlieffen Plan, the strategic blueprint for Germany's opening moves in the First World War, as an attempt to apply the same principle at the operational level of an entire theater of war. The intellectual chain from Marathon to Cannae to Schlieffen represents one of the longest continuous threads in the history of military thought. The hoplite phalanx itself, validated at Marathon as an offensive as well as defensive system, remained the dominant form of Greek land warfare for another century and a half. It was carried to its ultimate development by the Macedonian army of Philip II and Alexander the Great, who retained the phalanx as their heavy infantry corps while adding cavalry, light troops, and siege capabilities that gave it a combined arms flexibility the original system lacked. Alexander's campaigns, which extended Greek military power from Greece to the borders of India, rested on a foundation that Marathon had helped establish as the definitive Greek contribution to the art of war. The military consequences of Marathon, significant as they are secondary to its cultural and political consequences. And this is not a common way to frame a battle's importance, but it is the correct one for Marathon specifically. Athens in 490 BC was the site of the most advanced experiment in democratic self-governance that the ancient world had yet produced. Cleisthenes' reforms had created a system in which ordinary male citizens, not aristocrats, not property owners above a certain threshold, but a broad citizen body, participated directly in the decisions that governed their collective life. The assembly voted on war and peace, on legislation, on the appointment of generals. The courts were staffed by citizen jurors selected by lot. Public office was distributed widely rather than concentrated in aristocratic families. This system was 20 years old at Marathon. It had not yet produced its most celebrated figures. Socrates was not yet born. Pericles was a child. The Parthenon did not exist. The great tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides had not yet been written, though Aeschylus himself fought at Marathon and later wrote the Persians, the oldest surviving Greek tragedy, as a direct reflection on the Persian Wars. The philosophical schools that would define Western intellectual life for millennia were still decades in the future. All of this was contingent on Athens surviving 490 BC. A Persian-controlled Athens would not have been a city in which democratic self-governance could develop freely. Persia's standard practice with conquered cities was the installation of a friendly tyrant, as had been planned for Athens with Hippias, and the extraction of tribute. The specific conditions that allowed Athenian intellectual and cultural life to flourish in the 5th century BC, a free citizen body, the competitive democratic culture that drove artistic and philosophical achievement, the wealth generated by a self-governing commercial city, would have been fundamentally altered or destroyed. This is not a speculative extrapolation. It is a description of what Persian control meant in practice, demonstrated by what happened to every city that came under it. The Ionian Greeks who had lived under Persian rule for decades before the revolt were not producing philosophy and tragedy. They were paying tribute and keeping their heads down. What Athens produced between 490 and 400 BC, the century made possible in part by Marathon, shaped the intellectual and cultural foundations of the civilization that eventually produced the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the political philosophy underlying modern democratic states. The claim that Marathon changed Western history is not rhetorical flourish. It is a defensible historical argument about contingency and consequence. 2,500 years after the battle, the plain of Marathon retains a physical connection to the events of 490 BC that is unusual for antiquity. The Soros, the burial mound of the 192 Athenians, still stands. It rises approximately 10 meters above the flat plain, visible from a considerable distance, surrounded today by a small archaeological park. Visitors can walk to the base of the mound and look out across the plain toward the sea, roughly in the direction from which the Persian fleet would have been visible on the morning of the battle. The landscape has changed. The marsh that contributed to Persian casualties in the pursuit has been drained, and modern roads and buildings occupy parts of the plain. But the essential geography remains recognizable. The Archaeological Museum at Marathon contains material from excavations in the area, including grave goods from the Soros and from a separate burial mound associated with the Plataean dead. The physical evidence, the cremated remains, the pottery, the weapons, provides a material confirmation of Herodotus's account that is remarkable given the time elapsed. The marathon race, run in every modern Olympics since 1896, carries the name of the battle into the 21st century in the most widely recognized form. The 1896 Athens Olympics, organized in part as a deliberate revival of classical Greek heritage, included a race from the plain of Marathon to the Olympic Stadium in Athens as its most symbolically charged event. The Greek runner Spiridon Louis won the first Olympic marathon, becoming a national hero in a country that understood exactly what it meant to win a race named after that battle, in that city, in that year. The distance of 42.195 kilometers, standardized at the 1908 London Olympics to accommodate a course that ran from Windsor Castle to the Olympic Stadium, has no precise historical basis in the ancient sources. It is a product of modern Olympic organization rather than ancient geography. But the name, and the meaning behind the name, is genuine. Every marathon runner in every city in the world who crosses a finish line is unknowingly participating in a commemoration of what happened on that plain in September of 490 BC. Marathon has also given its name to a broader concept in political and cultural discourse, the idea of an outnumbered force, fighting against overwhelming odds, defeating a superior enemy through discipline, intelligence, and will. The word itself has become a shorthand for endurance, for the refusal to accept that size and power automatically determine outcome. This cultural resonance has outlasted the specific historical knowledge that produced it. Most people who use the word marathon in its metaphorical sense have no detailed knowledge of the battle. But the resonance itself is a form of historical memory, compressed and transmitted across centuries in a single word. In September of 490 BC, 10,000 men stood on a plain in Attica and made a decision that the largest empire in the world had given them every rational reason not to make. They could have waited behind the walls of Athens. They could have negotiated. They could have sent better terms to Darius and preserved the city at the cost of its independence. Every calculation of raw power pointed toward accommodation rather than resistance. The Persian Empire had absorbed every opponent it had faced. It had resources, experience, and momentum that no Greek city-state could match in a prolonged contest of attrition. They attacked anyway. What they built at Marathon, with their shields, their discipline, and one general's understanding of how to use the ground and the formation and the moment, was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration, proven in blood on a specific field on a specific morning, that the assumptions on which Persian power rested were not universal laws. That size did not automatically defeat quality. That an army fighting for something it believed in, under a commander who understood both his enemy and his tools, could overcome a force that had every reason to expect victory. The 192 men buried in the Soros did not know they were changing history. They were citizens of a democracy, doing what the democracy asked of them. In a crisis the democracy had created by choosing resistance over submission. They died on the plain where they fought, and the city buried them there as heroes, and the city went on to become the most culturally productive urban community in the ancient world. The battle they fought is studied in military academies. The democracy they defended shaped the political philosophy of the modern world. The race named after their battlefield is run by millions of people every year on every continent. Not bad for one morning's work. If this video gave you something, a detail you hadn't heard before, a different way of looking at a story you thought you knew, leave it in the comments. What surprised you most about Marathon? The tactical plan? The politics behind the battle? What happened to Miltiades afterward? Tell us below. And if you want more history told this way, no mythology, no shortcuts, the full story with everything it actually contains, subscribe and hit the bell. The next video covers another moment when the world could have gone in a completely different direction, and the people who made sure it didn't. See you there.